Oh, the whole, how I grade.
I'm sorry, I just can't remember.
What, it's perfectly simple. All right, so the process is I go through and I mark all the papers. So when you get the test back, you'll usually see a number out of 10, although sometimes you'll just see a fraction. And the fraction is the fraction of 10. And so you have a 1/2 next to it. You probably did not get half a point out of 10. You probably got half of 10. And just so long as I'm keeping track of that, it's good. Now, so I go through and there were the warm-up, the short answer, and the long answer. Those are the basically 3 types of problems. Sometimes there's no long answer problem, but on the first test, when you've got the ±0 bit, that's the long answer, a couple short answers, and then warm up, however many. So then I type into a spreadsheet the number of points you got for a particular problem. So let's say that you had 7, 9, 6 on the first. Let's say that's 1A, 1B, and problem 2. And then for short answer, 1A, 1B, 1C, 2A, 2B. And so you had 5, 0, 7, 10, 10. And for the long answer, you have 13. Typically, the way this is done is I would then average those 2 numbers. So for problem 1, you had 8 correct, and then for problem 2, you had 6 correct. For down here, I'd have an average of those 3, that's all part of problem number 1 for short answer. So that's 4, and then for problem 2, that's 10, and then 13 down here. I then, short answer, it sounds so much more convoluted in my head as I know I'm about to explain it, but it has evolved. So then I take these 2 numbers, and so that adds up to 14, and I multiply times 0.6. Because the warm-up are potentially not worth as much as the others. So 14 times 0.6 is 8.4. That adds up to 14, and that's 13. I add all those up, so 0.4 and 7, 5, I think 35.4. So from raw score to slightly manipulated score, that's the total. Do that for everybody who's taken the test. And then I look at what was the maximum, so not what the maximum score was by a student, but what was the maximum score for each problem. So if there's a problem that nobody got right, then that problem is not going to be worth, problem would only be worth whatever the maximum amount anybody got on it. And so then I compare that to what I call the student maximum. So let's say the student maximum was 37. So this person, I take that 35.4 divided by 37 times 100, and then I round that off. So that's the first number. There's going to be 3 numbers basically at the top of your test. That's how I came up with the first number. Now, going back to my first year here, student fine with free response, couldn't handle multiple choice for whatever reason. Bombed multiple choice, but did incredibly well on the more complicated things. And I thought it just doesn't seem fair. The student is obviously more than the number is giving. So I came up with another system for the second number of how many did you get right out of the student maximum for that type of problem. So for instance, on a warm-up, this person had 8.4. Let's say that the student maximum was 10, or let's make it 9. So I do 8.4 divided by 9 for a warm-up score. Short answer, the person had 14, and let's say it's out of, the student maximum was 20. So that's gonna be like a 92, something like that, or 0.92, that's a 0.7. And then 13, let's say the person had the top score for the long answer, so 1. I then average those three numbers together and come out with, and then multiply times 100, round it out, that's the second number. And then at some point over the past several years, I got to the point where I thought, this still doesn't feel right. So I came up with a third way, and that's gonna be the third number at the top of the page. I'm gonna make up numbers, so let's say that this ends up being 93, this ends up being 94. The third way is I just basically looked at all the scores and I just figured out what the score out of student maximum was if I just treated everything the same. So 1A counts the same as much as 1B, 1C, 2A, problem 3, so forth. Everything counts the same. What does that grade look like? So I just basically add up all of this and divide by whatever the student maximum is. And so let's say that comes out to be 89. So I got three numbers here, I take the highest number, and then I look at grades based on that. So once I have the highest numbers, having computed this three ways, 100 is not necessarily the highest score, but it basically, whatever the high score is based on the student maximum, that goes here. I then sort of break it down into, just from my own bookkeeping point of view, into 10% increments. So if this were not 100, but 110, this would be 99, 88, 77, and so forth. And then I just start writing down all the scores. Then I see where they clump. For instance, if I've got a 98 and a 97, those two should get the same grade. Because there really is not a whole lot of difference in the quality of work. If I've got a 98, 97, then an 88, well, there seems like there is some distinct difference in the quality. So if that is, say that's an A minus, this might be a B plus. Maybe there's a big jump down here, and 65 is the next grade. Well, that might be maybe it's a C plus. It depends on where things sort of break up.
What about the actual score we see on Blackboard out of 4?
So 4.A is a 4, A minus is a 3.7, B plus is a 3.3, a B is a 3, and then so on.
Okay.
The color coding that is done by Blackboard, because it's going to look at that, if you got a C on it, so I put down a 2, it's going to look at a 2 out of 4 and go, ooh, you got 50%, and it's going to give you a color coding of 50%, whatever that is. A 2 is not 50%, a 2 is a C. It might be 50%, now, the one time that there's an exception to the clumping is sometimes they get a long run. So maybe it's 98, 97, 96, 95, 94, 93, 92. There might be a very distinct difference in the quality of work between these two, which means that at some point I'm going to put a split in there. And I do think through over, well, those are pretty much the same, so those go together. But at some point it's going to, I'd like to think there's a better intellectual process, and there probably is, but in my mind I can justify it. Although I suspect if you looked over the years of my doing that, it might look a little bit arbitrary. So that's how I come up with the grades.
And then the description, is that just average from the first grade to the test correction?
All right. So, test corrections. So let's say that the maximum score on the test was 115 points. That's not necessarily based on student maximum, that's based upon if everything were done perfectly, based on the scale that was set up, 115 points. And you got 30 out of the 115. So, not a particularly great example of your work. That means that you missed, doing the fancy math here, 85 points. So you're trying to show me that you understand those missing 85 points. So you do test corrections, and the big thing with test corrections is to convince me that you understand. Please, don't just put down an answer. If you just put down an answer, you get absolutely no extra credit for that. Morning. Yeah. You just would like to see your name?
No, I thought I was supposed to like do something.
No.
No, sorry.
You don't have to.
Oh, child, it's right there.
And as much as the viewer in the audience would like to see the back of her head, I'm going to adjust the camera. So that now a fire hazard. I guess it's potentially in your way. Are you good?
No, I can see the board.
Okay. All right, so you're trying to convince me that you understand this 85 points that were missed. So let's say that this was a D. That would be an A+. If original score, best possible. So if you got an A, you can bring it up to an A+. So in other words, from a 4 to a 4.3. If you got an F, you could bring it up potentially up to a C. So from a 0 to a 2. And that's basically scaled from there. So if you got a C on the test, excuse me, well, a C is halfway between 0 and 4, and so you can bring it up to halfway between a 2 and a 4.3, which is a 3.15. So you hand in the test corrections. I'm going over the test corrections, and of this 85 points that were missed, I'm thinking, well, the person convinced me for 50 of the 85 points. Somewhat questionable, and the other ones really wasn't convinced. So 50 out of 85, the person got right. A D would be halfway between those, 2.65. .575, I think. Could easily have made another mistake there. I have it written down. So the person at the maximum could have brought it up to, and this is actually just barely into the B range. Could have brought it up to the B minus there, but they convinced me this fraction of it. Well, they could have improved their score from a 1 to there, so they could have improved their score 1.575 points overall. So I take that 50 over 85, and they multiply times the 1.575 points that they could have added to it, and then I add that to their original score. And that's what shows up in the grade book. More excruciating detail than I originally planned when I started this, but that's the process. And now that we have it on video for future classes, I can just say, hey, let's watch the video. If you would like more excruciating detail, if you'd like me to clarify anything I've said here, I'd be glad to. If you really want to get into the nuts and bolts of it, I will do that individually.
Sorry, this is like so extra. Could you, if you have like a B then, you can bring it up to like a,
0.725. Now typically, the students out of this range have missed so much that it's very difficult to get close to the maximum. People up here generally don't have the incentive. So not many people get the full potential. There've been a couple who have done it, and you can get help. Just, if you're trying to convince me, if I see two people, and I've seen this before, two people with identical corrections, it's not convinced me that either of them really understood what was going on. So, as, like with analysis questions, use your own words.
Do we have to convince you, like, we gotta come and talk to you about the answers, or we just?
Okay, on paper's fine.
Okay.
And I have found, I don't require you to explain why you put down your first answer, but I have found psychologically that when students do explain why they messed up the first time, that does help. Other questions concerning what I generally refer to as the sausage machine? Yes, Anita?
So do you mean like just solve the problem and show all the work? Or-
That generally does it.
Okay.
And sometimes you actually need to put it in a description. I mean, for some people who, they put the wrong units down there, I put down the wrong units. The units of force are newtons. I don't know what I was thinking. I thought it was part of my nightmare. Whatever it happens to be. But for some of them, you can start, I can read math well enough, so if you want to use math to describe what you're doing, that's fine. The ideal that I'm shooting for here is a second chance to learn, or another chance to learn the material. So that's the target. That's my ideal. So if you're questioning whether you're allowed to do something or not, just keep that in mind of, is this helping me learn the material? And please don't lie to yourself. Which is generally good advice. I'm trying to do that. Yes,
When are we getting them back?
today. All right, and general questions, it doesn't necessarily have to be about grades or the test. And hopefully it doesn't involve anything I just erased.
Can you go over 4A on the master set 6?
And what is 4A?
Ignoring effects of friction, two 1,000 kilogram cars are going to collide and stick together. One car is traveling north at 20 meters per second, and the other is traveling east at 10 meters per second. What is the final momentum of the combined wreck after the collision?
1,000 kilogram. North is up. And one's traveling north, one's traveling east. And, well, okay, they're going the same velocity or different velocities?
Different velocity. The one traveling north is at 20 meters per second, and the one traveling east is at 10 meters per second.
I did 40 and 10?
20 and 10.
20 and 10, okay.
Yes.
I'll use different numbers, just
Okay.
set up the model here. So instead of 1,000, let's just go all out and just say 2,000. These are, the car is closer to a typical car is around 1,000, so these are extra big, or extra massive. Let's have this go at 4 meters per second, let's make it slightly safer. And let's do this one at 3 meters per second. I did have it in the same mass, is that right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. All right, it's a two-dimensional problem. So just deciding what the positive direction is not enough. I have to bring in I hat and J hat. It doesn't really matter whether you want to make up or down positive, I hat or J hat, or left or right. but I'm just gonna go with the brainwashing that I think most of us have been subjected to. Just say to the right and up. I'm gonna call that I hat and J hat. So what is the momentum of this vehicle? Or how do you, what's the formula for momentum first off?
Mass times velocity.
Yep. I'm gonna call this A and call that one B. So the momentum of A initially is the mass of A times the velocity of A initially. So what would be the momentum of this?
Is it 2,000 kilograms times 4 meters per second?
That'll get you almost all the way. There's one little piece that you're missing, but that's the math problem right there. So what would it be?
8,000.
Okay. Any particular units?
Kilograms times meters per second.
Say it again?
Kilograms times meters per second.
Yep. One thing that we're missing?
I got.
Yes. It is a vector, direction matters. I have. All right, so the momentum of B initially is the mass of B times the velocity of B initially. So what would its momentum be?
kilograms meters per second, J hat.
Yep, absolutely. So the question, I believe, Luis?
Do we have to put the J hat at the end of the answer for like kilograms meters per second J hat? Is that
Yeah, so do you want to put it someplace else or just leave it off completely?
like, can we just leave it out completely, the J hat?
In the final answer, we do need to somehow indicate direction, because the question was, what's the momentum before the collision?
The final momentum of the combined rim after the collision.
After the collision.
Yeah.
Okay. We're ignoring the effects of friction, I believe?
Yes.
Yeah, and so the total momentum before is equal to the total momentum afterwards, so direction matters, given the way that the question's worded.